Hi, welcome back to NCS TV. I'm Taylor Seal. I teach third grade social studies at Sally Humble Elementary. Today we're going to be talking about types of communities. So what is a community? A community is a group of people living in a particular area, and usually people in a community also work in that area as well. There are three types of communities. We have urban, suburban, and rural. And so urban communities, they're usually big cities like this picture right here. You see lots of buildings that are really close together. There's lots of traffic and there's lots of people living in a smaller area. So there's skyscrapers, tall buildings, not a lot of open space. You don't see a whole lot of trees right here unless it's at something like a big public park. Many people take trains, taxis, or buses, and most plants are found in parks, like I said. Suburban communities look more like this. So that's more of like what we live in, right? It's more neighborhoods. They're located outside of cities. They're not as crowded. There's a smaller population, which means there's a smaller amount of people. Most people live in houses or smaller apartment buildings, so you should be familiar with that. Most everyone has a yard. There are more plants and trees, less traffic, and most people drive to get from place to place rather than taking taxis or buses or trains. And sometimes you can take buses or trains or walk, but mostly people drive cars. Our last type of community is a rural community. That's most likely going to be like the country. The houses are very spread out. They're usually miles and miles apart. There's open fields with lots of land, so lots of natural areas. They may be near a small town. There's very little traffic, and there's often specialized vehicles like tractors, right? And the land around rural communities are often used for agriculture or farming. So I have a story called The Little House. And The Little House, you're going to hear about it. And as you listen, I want you to see all of the different types of communities The Little House goes through as it gets older and older. Are you ready? It says, once upon a time there was a little house way out in the country. She was a pretty little house, and she was strong and well built. The man who built her so well said, "This little house shall never be sold for gold or silver, and she will live to see our great-great-grandchildren's great-great-grandchildren living in her." The little house was very happy as she sat on the hill and watched the countryside around her. She watched the sun rise in the morning, and she watched the sunset in the evening. Day followed day, each one a little different from the one before, but the little house stayed just the same. Okay, so it talked about the country, so the little house is in what kind of community? A rural community. Good job. In the night, she watched as the moon grew from a thin new moon to a full moon, and then back again to the thin old moon. And when there was no moon, she watched the stars. Way off in the distance, she could see the lights of the city. The little house was curious about the city and wondered what it would be like to live there. Time passed quickly for the little house as she watched the countryside slowly change with the seasons. In the spring, when the days grew longer and the sun warmer, she waited for the first robin to return from the south. She watched the grass turn green. She watched the buds on the trees swell and the apple trees burst into blossom. She watched the children playing in the brook. So see, the city's way far in the distance. In the long summer days, she sat in the sun and watched the trees cover themselves with leaves and the white daisies cover the hill. She watched the gardens grow, and she watched the apples turn red and ripen. She watched the children swimming in the pool. In the fall, when the days grew shorter and the nights grew colder, she watched the first frost turn the leaves to bright yellow and orange and red. She watched the harvest gathered and the apples picked. She watched the children going back to school. In the winter, when the nights were long and the days were short and the countryside covered with snow, she watched the children coasting and skating. Year followed year. The apple trees grew old and new ones were planted. The children grew up and went away to the city. Now at night, the lights of the city seemed brighter and closer. One day the little house was surprised to see a horseless carriage coming down the winding country road, and fewer carriages pulled by horses. Pretty soon along came some surveyors and surveyed a line in front of the little house. Pretty soon along came a steam shovel and dug a road through the hill covered with daisies. Then some trucks came and dumped big stones on the road, and some trucks with little stones, and some trucks with tar and sand. Finally, a steamroller came and rolled it all smooth, and the road was done. Okay, the rural community is now turning into what type of community do you think? Let's look at this picture right here. If you notice, houses are starting to pop up. It almost looks like a neighborhood, so this would be a suburban community. Good job. Now the little house watched the trucks and automobiles going back and forth to the city. Gasoline stations, roadside stands, and small houses followed by the new road. Everyone and everything moved much faster than before. More and more roads were made, and the countryside was divided into lots. More houses and bigger houses, apartment houses and tenant houses, schools, stores, and garages spread over the land and crowded around the little house. No one wanted to live in her and take care of her anymore. She couldn't be sold for gold or silver, so she just stayed there and watched. So you see all these big buildings that are popping up? Now it was not so quiet and peaceful at night. Now the lights of the city were bright and very close, and the street lights shone all night. This must be living in the city, thought the little house, and didn't know whether she liked it or not. She missed the fields of daisies and the apple trees dancing in the moonlight. Pretty soon there were trolley trains going back and forth in front of the little house. They went back and forth all day and part of the night. Everyone seemed to be very busy, and everyone seemed to be in a hurry. Pretty soon, there was an elevated train going back and forth above the little house. The air was filled with dust and smoke, and the noise was so loud that it shook the little house. Now she couldn't tell when spring came, or summer, or fall, or winter. It all seemed about the same. Pretty soon there was a subway going back and forth underneath the little house. She couldn't see it, but she could feel it and hear it. People were moving faster and faster. No one noticed the little house anymore. They hurried by without a glance. So look, all these big skyscrapers are popping up in the back. So our little house went from living in a rural community to living in a suburban community to now living in an urban community. Good job, like a big city. Pretty soon they tore down the apartment houses and tenant houses around the little house and started digging big cellars, one on each side. The steam shovels dug down 3 stories on one side and 4 stories on the other side. Pretty soon they started building up. They built up 25 stories on one side and 35 stories on the other. Now the little house only saw the sun at noon. She didn't see the moon or stars at night at all because the lights of the city were too bright. She didn't like living in the city. At night she used to dream of the country and the field of daisies and the apple trees dancing in the moonlight. The little house was very sad and lonely. Her paint was cracked and dirty, her windows were broken, and her shutters hung crookedly. She looked shabby, though she was just as good of a house as ever underneath. So look, our little house is right here, and you see the big skyscrapers on either side. Then, one fine morning in spring, along came the great-great-granddaughter of the man who built the little house so well. She saw the shabby little house, and she didn't hurry by. There was something about the little house that made her stop and look again. She said to her husband, "That little house looks like the little house that my grandmother lived in when she was a little girl. Only that little house was way out in the country on a hill covered in daisies and apple trees growing around." They found out that it actually was the very same house, so they went to the movers to see if the little house could be moved. The movers looked at the little house all over and said, "Sure, this little house is as good as ever. She's built so well we could move her anywhere." So they jacked up the little house and put her on wheels. Traffic was held up for hours as they slowly moved her out of the city. So you see, this is them moving the little house. They jacked it up, which means they took it up off the ground, and they're moving it out of the city. At first, the little house was frightened, but after she got used to it, she rather liked it. They rolled along the big road. They rolled along the little roads until they were way out in the country. When the little house saw the green grass and heard the birds singing, she didn't feel sad anymore. They went along and along, but they couldn't seem to find just the right place. They tried the little house here, they tried the little house there. Finally, they saw a little hill in the middle of a field, and apple trees growing around. "There," said the great-great-granddaughter. "That's just the place." "Yes, it is," said the little house to herself. A cellar was dug on top of the hill, and slowly they moved the little house from the road to the hill. The windows and shutters were fixed, and once again they painted her a lovely shade of pink. As the little house settled down on her new foundation, she smiled happily. Once again she could watch the sun and moon and stars. Once again she could watch spring, summer, fall, and winter come and go. And once again she was lived in and taken care of. Never again would she be curious about the city. Never again would she want to live there. The stars twinkled above her. A new moon was coming up. It was spring, and it was all quiet and peaceful in the country. Okay, guys, now that's a fiction story, so you know it's made up, but it tells us about the 3 different types of communities. If you saw in the beginning, the rural community was very small, spread out, lots of open land, but there weren't a lot of houses that were close to each other, so that's why the little house was on her own. Then, eventually, it turned more into a suburban community, more like a neighborhood. There were houses everywhere. And eventually, that land was built up and big skyscrapers moved in, and it became a... So guys, that was a fun little story, and it was a fiction story, which you know that means that it's not real. But it did show about the 3 types of communities. In the beginning, the little house was alone in a lot of open land, so that would have been a rural community, right? There was some dirt roads, but there weren't any paved roads. All the houses were spread out, lots of room for farming. Now, the second type of community was when the house started to be surrounded by other little houses. That's a suburban community, almost like a neighborhood. It's located outside of a city. And the last community was an urban community, and that's where there were big, tall skyscrapers. It was really busy, lots of traffic, and a large population. Guys, I'm so glad you got to tune in with us today. Come back to see some more. Thank you. Bye.